Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Dee Dee Petri, President and CEO of the Olmsted Network, and I welcome you today for the third in our series this year of Conversations with Olmsted. I hope you enjoyed the medley of old and new slides as we began this program. These are works by Olmsted, as well as work by our panelists and other artists in Olmsted Parks, and will serve as a backdrop to our discussion today about exploring Olmsted through art. We are especially thankful to our moderator, Ruth Fremson, photographer of the New York Times, who is taking time away from her assignment at the Democratic National Convention to be with us today. I mention this for two reasons. First, we in the Olmsted world have a special fondness for the New York Times and its first publisher, Henry Raymond, who hired Olmsted as an undercover reporter in the South in what proved to be an immensely formative experience in Olmsted's life. I also can't resist noting that Frederick Law Olmsted did not himself shy away from the political sphere. Indeed, he was put forth as a candidate for vice president on the conscience ticket in 1872, an effort that flattered him, but that he nevertheless rejected. Of course, you can learn more about all these topics by going to our website, olmsted.org. You can also find there our national calendar that is absolutely chock-a-block with activities around the country. Of particular note is our upcoming conference, September 13 through 15 in Newburgh and Poughkeepsie, New York. 2024 is the 200th anniversary of the birth of Calvert Vaux, and we look forward to exploring landscapes of renewal, Olmsted, Vaux, and Downing, as we tour their landscapes in the Hudson Valley. For a small group of lucky people, we're offering a tour of Matthew Benson's Stonegate Farm and Frederick Church's Olana on Friday, September 13, with cocktails on the Olana Piazza. On September 14 and 15, we have a terrific lineup of speakers, including Frank Kowski, Sarah Zodi, Dr. Howard Frumkin, Vassar President Elizabeth Bradley, and Robert Kirkbride. And we hope you will join us as we honor great Olmsted champions around the country, including Christian Zimmerman, the legendary landscape architect at Prospect Park, the Garden Club of Orange and Dutchess counties, and teachers and students at Newburgh Free Academy West, and Henry Hester, a long-term volunteer at Friends of Keeney Park in Hartford, Connecticut. So if you haven't yet registered, there is still time. Today, it is our pleasure to explore Olmsted through art, and we are honored to have Ruth Fremson as our moderator. On Olmsted's 200th birthday, Ruth published an extraordinary photo essay, Olmsted's Enduring Gift, alongside her piece, An Assignment I Needed, Frederick Law Olmsted's Legacy. Joining her today are three remarkable panelists: Gary Hildebrand, principal and founder of the firm Reed Hildebrand, and chair of the Department of Landscape Architecture at Harvard University's Graduate School of Design. Gary and his firm have been involved in a limitless number of important projects concerning Olmsted landscapes, including the Franklin Park Action Plan in Boston, the Blue Garden in Newport, and the Arnold Arboretum Leventritt Garden. Joining Gary is Jane Leffler, an artist and architectural historian who 50 years ago was the assistant curator of the National Gallery exhibit dedicated to Frederick Law Olmsted. You saw many of her paintings in the run-up to the program, as well as some remarkable historic photos, which were part of the National Gallery's examination of Olmsted as landscape architect and artist. You can learn more about Jane's work in the chat box. Joining us from the Emerald Necklace Conservancy is Anita Morrison-Matra, an urban planner who now serves as the Conservancy's first senior advisor for cultural partnerships and parks equity. Anita comes on board to follow up on the award-winning Olmsted Now initiative, which explored ways the Conservancy could more successfully involve the community in activating the parks during the bicentennial. We were delighted to team up with Anita during the City Parks Alliance National Conference. As is our custom, we will hear from panelists for about 40 minutes and then hear from you, our audience. Please let us know where you're from in the chat box, but submit any questions you have through the Q&A box. With that, let me turn this over to Ruth. Welcome to Conversations with Olmsted.
Thank you, Dee Dee, and thank you for having me. And I'm delighted to be here with these wonderful panelists. And thanks to our audience who's also joining. We hope that we can make this a really participatory discussion, and we welcome all of your questions in the chat. So please don't be shy and throw them in anytime. Let's get started here. We will start with saying that Laurie Olin once suggested that Central Park is the greatest work of art in America. And Daniel Burnham also said that Frederick Law Olmsted's work was painting with lakes and wooded slopes, with lawns and banks of and forest-covered hills, with mountainsides and ocean views. And I myself, think that when you look at Olmsted's work, it's very deceptive because you feel yourself to be fully in nature, but then when you realize it is a very created and orchestrated spaces to be in, and very, very inspiring. So I'd like to start first with Gary and then Jane, and I'd like to ask you guys what you think. Do you think that it's appropriate to call Olmsted's landscape art? Gary, would you start with us, please?
Well, thank you, Ruth. I like the question a lot. I think there's a good prompt inside the question. Laurie, who was my teacher in the 1980s and remains a good friend, is echoing there an idea that entered the conversation while Olmsted was still working, still alive. I'll explain that in a minute. But the Burnham quote is a really good starting point. To me, it's patently true that Olmsted was interested in composition with the landscape medium. And he did believe that the scenic part of his work was vitally important. He said this in really plain language in a letter to the art critic Marianne van Rensselaer in 1893, well into the mature phase of his career. He wrote the letter in bed because he was tired all the time. I'll quote here: "The root of all my good work is an early respect for, regard, and enjoyment of scenery." Now here's the important part: "and extraordinary opportunities of cultivating susceptibility to the power of scenery." He's referring there to a kind of theory of perception, where one is made susceptible to feelings and emotions driven by scenery. He read the theory of the picturesque early in his life through the work of the British authors William Gilpin and Uvedale Price, and this had a pretty big effect on his travels and ultimately on his making landscapes. In Olmsted's words, scenery, natural scenery, exists, quote, "for the mind without fatigue, and yet exercises it, tranquilizes it, and yet enlivens it." But for the art question, for me, it goes a little bit deeper. I'll use the American philosopher John Dewey's contention that art is experience. Art embodies expression that is experienced, where meaning is sought and is connected with what's good and right. In that way of thinking, I would say Olmsted's work is more profoundly expressive of the democratic space of urban parks. In some ways, he invented this, and it leads to the contention that this work of Olmsted is an art of moral purpose towards the betterment of livelihoods. And let me have one more elaboration. The social critic and Harvard art professor Charles Eliot Norton said in the 1890s, again while Olmsted was still alive, that of all the great American artists, Olmsted stood, quote, "first in the production of great works which answer the needs and give expression to the life of our immense and miscellaneous democracy." I'm going to repeat it. "First in the production of great works which answer the needs and give expression to the life of our immense and miscellaneous democracy," end quote. In 1932, in its great publication of The Brown Decades, the urbanist Lewis Mumford repeated this and said, "This is not an exaggeration." So that's how I see the art problem. It's an art of moral purpose for America. And we could say the historian Albert Fine, who was also one of my teachers, popularized Central Park as the greatest expression of American democracy in the 1960s. And Ethan Carr, another historian whom we all know, has also been heard on this topic. So I think it's a rich one.
I would say I have to agree with you, Gary. The idea of natural scenery for the minds and having an impact on us all is something that really inspired me when I was working on my photo essay,
Yeah, I can
because
tell.
as a photojournalist, it is it's what I do, is to document daily life. And there's no better place, right, to document all the wonderful things that happen in public spaces, and particularly Olmsted spaces I found were quite inspiring when it came to being a venue for how life plays out. And I think, you could find all sorts of joyous occasions and fraught occasions and simple, quiet occasions, just the general respite of mind that he sometimes said we need. They're the most remarkable stage sets for life to play out. And that's what I focused on in my photo essay. Jane, I'd love to hear from you a little bit about what you think about that question about, are Olmsted's landscapes a work of art, and how you've been inspired?
I think that they would qualify as art, but they weren't intended as art. They were social spaces, and Olmsted was first and foremost a social thinker, a scientist, an engineer, and a social planner, you could say. He started out as a farmer, scientific farmer. He was trying to better the land and make better use of the land and find better ways of using land. He was very concerned about the inequities of the slavery system in the country, and he visited the South, and he was despairing over the treatment of the people involved, but also the way it was ruining the land in the South. And it was not considering the future of the land and how it would be dealt with. It was so wasteful, he felt. And I think that this very much affected his views on the idea of better use of land and how it could be better envisioned for the future. And when he came back and was addressing the urban situations, he put to use this idea of communicativeness, that there was a way in which people could come together in a democratic way. That after he visited parks in England, for instance, we didn't have those kind of parks in this country, public parks, open to everyone. And he wanted to make that kind of experience available to Americans, where they could come together, no matter who they were, and participate in being in a democratic space, let's call it. The beauty of the space was, as you've heard, was part of that. The scenic beauty of the space went into the calming of the mind and making you feel better about yourself and about other people, and it made an opportunity for people to come together. But it was a vehicle for making those spaces work. And they were constructed spaces. They weren't natural spaces. People think Central Park was just found that way, but it was a built environment. And all of the places that Olmsted had his hand in were built environments. Almost all of them, I'm pretty much, you could put in that category. They were rebuilt in one way or another. And so if you look through his papers, you won't find sketches, a lot of sketching, a lot of doodling about views and vistas and things like that. Many landscape architects do that kind of work. You find a lot of words, a lot of description of what his purposes were and what he wanted to achieve and how he wanted to do it, and the political process that it would take to make those things possible. So it's more than just art as it's really performance art. It's art in the broadest sense, it's art where it happens. And I want to say one thing about the photographs of the Olmsted Parks. So many people have photographed them as desolate, empty places. And in that show that we saw maybe 15 years, 20 years ago, I've lost track of time, but as if they existed without anybody in them. And that's not what he had in mind. They didn't exist apart from the people who used them. They existed for the very purpose of being used and enjoyed. So I think I would take issue with the idea of them as art separated from how they were experienced.
Jane, that is like the answer that goes right to my heart, because that is exactly what I was looking at when I was trying to show his 200-year legacy. You know, I thought the same thing you did. I did my research. I saw all sorts of beautiful, beautiful landscape photography. And I thought, well, this is great, but how can I take this a step further? And for me, I thought, you know, the legacy is what he has given to people. And I've often said, and again, being here at the DNC, it's another way of bringing this point up, which is that this is a man who had a vision, and he knew he was never going to see his vision matured. And the way he envisioned it, he was never going to live that long. You know, a tree grows, you know, how long do you have? Are you going to be around for 50 years, 20 years, 200 years? And I was always very moved by the fact that he had that foresight and the generosity of that foresight. And that's something that I wish we could say about all our politicians today, that they weren't doing it just for the next 4 years. But I digress. I love your answer, but I'd like to ask you, as a curator, you were an assistant curator for the exhibit at the National Gallery 50 years ago. We've talked about that already a little bit. And as I understand it, this was the first time that landscape plans and drawings had ever been displayed in the gallery. So I'm wondering if you could tell us a little bit about how that exhibit came about and what was really significant about it when it comes to thinking about this topic of Olmsted in art.
Well, the Sesquicentennial Committee was formed in 1971-72 to celebrate the sesquicentennial, which was a very big word then and still. And the one thing that's important to note that happened before that, when I was working at the BRA in Boston Redevelopment Authority, my boss, Mike Weinmeier, published a book in 1968, which was a very important book that was the first book that published Olmsted's plans. And up until then, the only things that people really knew about him were his travels in the South, but very little had been written about him. Laura Woodroper's biography hadn't come out yet. Al Fine's biography hadn't come out yet. This was the very first really important book that UMass Press put out of the design of the plans themselves. And landscape architects and others got to see the plans for the very first time. And I think it really was a revelation to many people to see those plans. And there was a big fold out for Central Park that opened out of the middle of that book. And I think that's part of what got these fellas going to think up this idea for the exhibition. But the exhibition was 4 years later, and it was two or three designers in New York came up with this idea, and they posited it to the museums here in Washington and to the Whitney in New York. And Fritz Gutheim, who was the director of the Olmsted Sesquicentennial here, nobody wanted the show. It was a crazy idea of a show at the time. And nobody knew who Olmsted was. But he took the idea and figured that there was a way to get it into the National Gallery. And the way was through his friend Dan Kiley was friends with Bunny Mellon, who is married to the chairman of the board of the National Gallery, Paul Mellon. And through that, he got himself in to see Carter Brown, who had just been appointed the new director of the National Gallery. Mr. Brown wanted to develop new audiences for the National Gallery. And he said, well, he didn't really think this was art, but he would do it for Mrs. Mellon's sake. And she was an avid gardener. So out of that, he agreed to take this very poorly organized show and show the landscape plans as art framed on the walls, even though there was some doubt as to whether they belonged in the National Gallery. Other things about that show that were the firsts were the use of live plants in the gallery spaces, carpeting in the gallery spaces, and an audiovisual show, which was a disaster in terms of functionality, but was the very first time the gallery ever embarked upon audiovisual. And that was an immersion experience where you would go in and feel you were in Central Park or Prospect Park or whatever. And that was a really big step forward for the gallery because they didn't have anybody to run that kind of a show where the carousels kept breaking down. So Mrs. Mellon brought her topiaries in for the opening of the show from her greenhouses. I mean, it was a big family event, and people were very excited by it. And I think that people were very unfamiliar with looking at plans, but something about seeing the plans in conjunction with photographs of the places helped people to translate the two-dimensional fact of the plan to the three-dimensional space of the landscape. And they were able to make that leap that very few people can, looking at a plan and seeing a place. And I think that really put Olmsted on the mental map. That show really did do a lot to get his name out there, and a lot of publishing projects followed from that. And then the Olmsted movement, a lot of people saw the show and went back and got activated, I think you could say.
So I wonder, I think you're probably right. I mean, I don't see how it could have been otherwise, but I wonder, did working on that project also help you? Did it inspire your own work? And how has moving on a little bit, how has Olmsted inspired your work?
Oh, I didn't get inspired at all. At that time, I was a city planner back then. I was wearing a different hat when I came out of the GSD. I was wearing another hat completely. I went back and got my doctorate, and I became an architectural historian. I went in a different direction. I didn't come to the art, doing my art until I retired from that. And I loved landscape. And I loved landscape since I was a little girl growing up in Brookline and spending all the time we could at Jamaica Pond and looking at that little island with the willow trees on it and thinking that was the most beautiful thing I could ever imagine seeing, and thinking that someone had designed that was beyond my anything I could imagine. But I wasn't inclined to try and depict anything of that sort until I had the time and stopped writing and started painting. And when I stopped writing, I started painting, and I painted landscapes. And they were all trees. All I want to paint is trees, sometimes water, but mostly trees.
Okay. How about you, Gary? I'd love to hear how Olmsted has inspired your work.
Well, I think I have two things to say, Ruth. First of all, I should say I loved Jane's recitation of how that exhibition came to be. But I have a footnote to add. I know Jane's aware of it. Mike Weinmeyer's and Julius Fabos's advisor at Harvard GSD when they put the exhibition together and then the book was Albert Fine. What we could add, let's say, further back is that, and I think to which we owe a lot, is that departments of social science were taking up Olmsted as a reformed figure in PhD dissertation work in the 50s. And you think of Charles McLaughlin and Charles Beveridge. I think there's where Olmsted is discovered. Let's say the impact and the importance of Olmsted as a figure of reform in the United States in the 19th century is, let's say, repositioned. And Albert Fine is a part of that. He was he taught first at Long Island University in the Department of History, Urban History. So we owe a debt to the scholars, which led to the exhibition and book that you mentioned. I have a couple of copies of it, including a first printing you might want to see someday. The second thing is that the way that Olmsted inspires my work is going to sound a little grandiose, but what I really love about this figure, and I read biography, it's, in my, let's say in my summer reading, I just spend almost all of my time reading biography. I love it. And I was stunned by Laura Wood Roper's biography and got to meet her once as an undergraduate. That was in 1976, I believe. But when I look across the life of Olmsted, what I see is that he exemplifies a great generalist. And I think landscape architects are generalists. Olmsted was a traveler. Jane mentioned, so many of these things. He was an experimental farmer and a pharmacist. He was a planter. He produced seeds, specialized seeds. He was a raconteur, a cosmopolitan social observer and a critic, a journalist and publisher, and an incredible manager, right? He managed a mine in California. He managed the what became the Red Cross during the Civil War, and he managed Central Park. So he had to quit 5 times. It was such a hard job. All these things were part of the formation of Olmsted, the landscape architect. And I think you're aware, my Harvard colleague, Sarah Zodi, has raised this point on one of your conversations during the bicentennial year. She sees all of those things that Olmsted did. Some people say, amateur culture, pre-professional, whatever you want to call it, are part of his becoming a landscape architect who made work that had a moral imperative to it. So I don't want to compare myself to Olmsted, but I see myself as a generalist, not a specialist. I'm interested in a lot of things. And I try to bring all my experiences to bear in my work and my writing and in my teaching. So doing so with clarity and cultural relevance maybe that's the challenge in the work.
I love your answer so much, and explain to you why. I am a photojournalist who is a generalist. I have also covered all sorts of topics, and they become the sum of who I am. And I think I love thinking that I could be like flow that way. So I love your answer. That's wonderful.
Thank you.
Thank you. I'd like to switch a little bit and go to Anita, please. And just shift gears a tiny bit. Would you tell us a little bit about Olmsted Now, the creation of Committee of Neighborhoods, and what you've learned about activating and programming artwork in the parks?
Definitely. So thank you so much. So we were thinking, the Emerald Necklace Conservancy was thinking a lot about how to celebrate the bicentennial. And we knew that a lot of folks, everyone would focus on the landscapes, the amazing beauty that has been left with us in our care. And we were starting to think more about some of the writings and some of his beliefs, and wanted to think about, well, what would Olmsted be focused on now? And we really thought that maybe he would be focused on the relationship between people and parks and how people utilize these spaces. And so Olmsted Now is a coalition-led platform that used various key stakeholders to connect communities and organizations in making parks and public spaces more vibrant and welcoming for all. It really included this opportunity for highlighting diverse programming and use throughout the entire necklace. And what we did in order to kind of create a really balanced, equitable system is we reached out to Grayscale Collaborative, and they helped us identify some key stakeholders that really represented the voice throughout the entire necklace. And so we brought together about 10 to 15 people. It varied depending on the week. And they were really the body that helped inform how we would spend a pocket of funds in supporting artists and creatives to program the spaces throughout the necklace. We also partnered with Design Center for Social Intervention, and they helped us lead these conversations, which at times can be a bit challenging, right? There we're unearthing a lot of kind of current day issues. And so they really helped us ground the work and the excitement and the potential for joy throughout these spaces. We had the opportunity to fund various artists and creatives, about $200,000 throughout the year. And what we learned was, of course, that people were excited about utilizing these spaces in this way, but we also started to understand more about the barriers to access. And it wasn't just about kind of their own stigma and bias, but it was a lot of systemic challenges. And I think they existed for a lot of others as well, around permitting and what that system looked like, around how you're getting the word out, what does funding look like, who's funded, et cetera. So, some additional barriers that we hope to focus on and continue to open up access for everyone.
Okay, that's great. And I guess in that vein, I'd like you to maybe tell us a little bit about how parks can become an essential part for a livable city, and how the Emerald Necklace in particular has invited artists and creatives to use the landscape to put art in the art.
Definitely. Yeah. Well, parks provide us with so much. I think, we know that it's a sense of peace, and often it's support for our public health benefit. But there's also opportunities for joy and celebration. So inviting artists and creatives to assist in that provides us the opportunity to experience modern artists' work in conversation with Frederick Law Olmsted, which I think kind of heightens the experience. One such artist that really helped us do that was Fujiko Nakaya in 2018. 5 different fog sculptures that really interacted with 5 different spaces along the Emerald Necklace, and curated by Jen Margell. It was a beautiful opportunity for us to not only see what Fujiko Nakaya could do with the fog, but also integrate other artists and creatives. There were folks who were playing music through the fog and dancing. So it was really a layered experience for a lot of folks. It was absolutely beautiful.
Is there a process that you could explain? I mean, some people in our audience might be wondering, they may be artists themselves who are wondering, I would love to have an exhibit in Franklin Park or Central Park or somewhere. Is there a process that you guys have that is easy to explain where an artist could actually find their way to, without knowing Bunny Mellon, to get their work shown at some place?
So it's definitely a partnership. The Emerald Necklace Conservancy is stewards of the park, working in partnership with the city of Boston. So I think it's really the artist identifying whether there's an opportunity or not, and reaching out to either an organization or the city of Boston to see what's possible. And then they go through kind of the general permitting process. And sometimes there's just little tweaks that have to happen, but because we want to make sure that we're maintaining the integrity of the historic space. But usually that's kind of how it works.
Okay. I wonder if I can get each of us to maybe talk a little bit about the Olmsted landscape that we feel is the most special to us. I I don't know who would like to go first on that one. Gary, would you like to talk about? Oh, Jane, would you like to go first on that?
Well, I'm sitting here looking out my windows at the zoo, and I love the National Zoo. And it's part of Rock Creek Park here in Washington. And I think that it is a spectacular landscape, and I love it. I'm very fortunate that I'm surrounded on, well, all these windows looking out at all I see is trees, 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 trees. It's very, very beautiful. And they're all going to change colors, and I'm going to see them all change colors, and it's going to be very beautiful. And I know each one is going to change and what it's going to do, and it's going to depend on the heat and the humidity and everything. And it's all fascinating and beautiful. And actually, there are isolated red leaves now, 1, 2, 3, 4 that came this week, and that's a harbinger of something. I don't know what. I didn't never take botany, but that if I'm painting, that gives me a focal point, one red leaf. I love it. It's beautiful.
Oh,
And there's animals too, because it's a zoo. But you don't have to like the animals, but I do like the animals.
but you
And
don't paint them.
I don't paint animals, but I like the sloth bears and the flamingos especially. And I know the pandas are coming back, and that's a big selling point. Our zoo is free. I understand your zoo in Boston is not free. So that's a problem. But this zoo is free, 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 and it's a very big attraction from the Smithsonian. But it's a big attraction. And Olmsted laid it out. It's very steep hills because that was the terrain that came with the zoo. He didn't try to level it. He didn't try to make it easy to walk. And the animals don't care. They're not walking around anyway. But the people have to hoof it if you want to go from one end of the zoo to another, it's quite a hike. But the grade change is tremendous from Connecticut Avenue down to the other side of the zoo. But that's part of what makes it a great experience. I mean, you're crossing Rock Creek Park. It's that whole experience is wonderful that we have that in the middle of our city. And that's also thanks to Olmsted and his son.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Anita, do you have a favorite park, a favorite Olmsted place?
Yes, the Overlook Shelter Ruins. So one of very few structures that Olmsted built. There was changing rooms and a view of the Playstead. It was destroyed in a fire in 1940s, but repurposed. The hollowed out area was repurposed by Elma Lewis for Elma Lewis Playhouse in the Park. And, had the likes of Duke Ellington performing. And also was utilized by Fujiko Nakaya for Fog and Flow, another beautiful fog sculpture, and continues to be repurposed by artists and creatives to this day.
What about you, Gary?
Great answer, Anita. Really, I love it. Until around 8 or 9 years ago, I would have said the Central Park in New York because I grew up going there on Saturdays and Sundays. I was interested in the popular culture that the park supported as a teenager, and I've just been attracted to it ever since, and I just think it is one of the great creations of all time. Your question is a little bit like, asking which of your kids is your favorite when you have 5 brilliant people in the house. I will say that a little bit in Anita's direction, Franklin Park has become very near and dear to me. First, because we started using it as a site for teaching in our Master in Landscape Architecture program, because we were interested in the second semester of a 6-semester course, their students to undertake something of great complexity in a landscape. And, this is surely one of the most complex places when you think about Franklin Park in the context of its communities, its surrounding communities. And, then we were very fortunate. My firm was very fortunate to be selected for a master plan. We turned that into the action plan very quickly. And so, we've gone over it with a fine-tooth comb, and, we've spent a lot of time there. My colleagues in the office, especially Kristen Fredrickson, John Kett, and Lydia Gekas Cook, really spent 3 years developing the action plan. I was alongside them, but in the office. And you just come to know it like you didn't before. And one of the things that we've learned, and Ethan Carr, the historian, was on our team as a Brain Trust member and reviewer, and he was writing his book on the park at the time. So he was feeding chapters to us. And I just learned so much, from working with the physicality of it, working with the complexity of the social dynamic of basically the neighbors taking more care of it than the city. And there's a big history there, important environmental justice history. And then, really learning what Ethan was gathering from archival work. And the point that I would really like to stress about Franklin Park is that it comes late in Olmsted's career. He's a mature landscape architectural designer at that point, been doing it for 25 years, in the latter part of a long life, So Ethan's point, and I'm just going to describe it for you because I agree entirely with it, is that the park was already a scenery of a kind. Now, basically, the city had assembled a number of farms and had commissioned Olmsted, 525 acres to design the park. We were very sure about this. He had a deep understanding of the surface geology of the park. And so the park's organization is absolutely rooted in the native terrain and the character of that terrain. There wasn't, as in other parks by Olmsted, a lot of manipulation. In fact, he was, in the way that Ethan would describe this, is that he was a strong enough designer, a confident enough designer to leave things as they were and not do too much. And then we get, 125 years later, sorry, much longer. I'm sorry, no, it's 1885, right? So it's, 120 or so years. We get this amazing scenic condition, but then we have the life in the park, which Anita has, described in beautiful ways. That is because while it is a national treasure, maybe you could say an international site of heritage, it is a local park. And, the work that we've done there has to be framed as benefiting the local community, or it doesn't survive, it doesn't work. So, for a lot of reasons, my heart lands in Franklin Park.
That's a good reason. A lot of good reasons. I think for me, I'm like you. I think you can't pick a favorite child. And my travels around the country, while not comprehensive, I certainly found beauty in all of them and special things about every single Olmsted space that I visited. But I think the place that I was the most moved was when I went up to Niagara Falls Park, because when I speak to young photographers, and I do that sometimes, mentor them or just work with them, I always tell them something that a photographer told me when I was starting out, a photographer named April Saul, who worked for the Philadelphia Inquirer. And she said, don't photograph the sunset, photograph the reflection. And that has stuck with me my entire career, and I like to pass it on. And that's what I felt when I went up there. It wasn't Olmsted had the vision not to just preserve the falls themselves, but the run up to the falls and create this beautiful, beautiful park that was the river leading to it. And I found that incredibly moving and incredibly special. And I think for me, that becomes my moment of that's my little place as a reminder.
You know, laying that
So-
out was really an act of making sure that developers wouldn't build hotels on the cliffs. And
Right.
that was forefront in his mind there, and also, you know, for Yosemite.
Yeah, and if you go visit Niagara Falls today, just look across the way to Canada and see what they've done on their side of the falls, and you have no starker example of why we appreciate Olmsted so much, I think. So I think unless there's something else you guys would like to address, I would like to open it up to our audience. I've run out of my questions. Is there anything I have not mentioned or should mention? Anita? Jane? Is that painting behind your right shoulder and anything you were inspired by
That's,
Olmsted for?
World's End in Hingham. That's World's End in Hingham, which I have painted many times and different from different views. It's got a salt marsh in front of it, and I have painted the salt marsh and I've painted the trees. I never knew what it was and why those trees were there. I didn't know Olmsted had anything to do with that. I had a house in Hull, and I kept thinking, well, that's funny. That's just a bunch of trees over there and nobody's done anything. I had no idea that Olmsted had laid that out long ago, and it was meant to be a subdivision for housing, and it failed, and it ended up becoming a trust property in Hingham, and it's sticking out into the harbor. It has fabulous views of Boston and of Hull and of itself. And I'm sure that most of you who are local have been there. It's great for hiking. And anyway, the trees are unbelievably interesting there. And I think that's based on the view from the east. That's how it really does look.
Well, I think it looks like a beautiful painting from my point of view here. So I'm glad you included that for us.
Well, I feel close to it since I spent so many years looking at that view. I feel very close to that vista. My family likes to hike there, but I'm not so much interested in the hiking as the views.
Well, thank you for sharing that with us. We have a bunch of questions coming in now, so maybe I'll turn to those for a little bit here. Here we go. We have a question from the audience. We've talked about the restorative beauty of landscape parks, and yet in so many cities, parks are being seen as places for building and programs. How did Olmsted balance active and passive purposes in his parks? Gary, would you like to take that one on?
Surely. Ethan Carr's book on Franklin Park has been out now for 6 or 7 months, and I have an afterword in the book. And I made a comment on this, on a version of this question. In contemporary times, there is a kind of simplistic use of active and passive. I think that doesn't do justice to experience in landscape architecture, in landscapes. I think we have maybe more robust ways of thinking of gradients of active and quiet. But what I learned from Ethan, again, is that Olmsted had advised against recreational active recreational works in the park, in Franklin Park. And, he actually advised the city to build Franklin Field a couple of blocks away and to put most of the active sports there. There were some active sports in the Playstead, which is where White Stadium is now in the Bear Dens. Olmsted referred to something called receptive recreation. And by that, I think he was referring to that term I used before, quoting him. You're in a place where you're susceptible to the benefits of scenery, to the power of scenery. So I do think we live in a different time. I think parks need activation because parks are expensive to maintain and to rebuild. There is an equation there. And, I have to praise the Emerald Necklace Conservancy for all they've done for Franklin Park and the rest of the Emerald Necklace. I mean, they've just made remarkable strides, from silviculture and forest management, to rebuilding the Back Bay Fens, portions of the Back Bay Fens. Parks are really, really costly. City budgets have tended to be reducing the amount spent. We have, a nice commitment from Mayor Wu to bolster that, but there is a tendency in places, say like Bryant Park, to over-program because the revenue stream is really big, and Bryant Park is very beautiful because of that revenue stream. So it's hard to dissociate that. The fiduciary responsibility of stewards of the parks requires that they raise money a lot.
Yeah, that's interesting, Gary. Thank you. We have a question here, which I think is going to be directly for Jane, please. Anne Marie, who curated an exhibit on Olmsted in Milwaukee, asks, was there a catalog produced for the 1972 Olmsted sesquicentennial?
There was a pamphlet I wrote, which was distributed at the exhibit, but no catalog. And if anyone wants a copy of that pamphlet, I can provide that. I can email. I can make a facsimile and email that to anybody who wants it. But it doesn't detail. It includes a plan of what was in the exhibition, not the actual items, but what was the room, the spaces that made up the exhibition. It was a linear exhibition. But they didn't have a catalog. They had all they could do to get the stuff up on the walls.
Yeah, I can imagine.
Very short time frame, but it did consist of plans, drawings, and photographs, blown up archival photographs, and the big painting, Sargent's painting of Olmsted from Biltmore, which got lost en route from Biltmore to the gallery and was discovered in a storage facility the day before it was supposed to be, the show was opening. They were looking everywhere for it all over Washington. I mean, it's 10 feet high. It's hard to lose something that big. They did.
That's amazing. That is a great anecdote. I can't imagine the stress that was going on in that museum at that time. Okay, well, I'm sorry to cut you short on that one. I want to get this one in for Anita, though, before we have to wrap it up. I'm sorry, Jane.
Oh, I said I'll get her a copy of the pamphlet if she wants it.
That's very kind of you. Anita, we have two questions here. I'm going to try to roll them into one. You talked about engaging community in art. What did you learn about community engagement generally? And then there's another one from Winifred from New Jersey, who is just talking about having applied for a grant and being turned down, and is wondering if perhaps you could help identify specific elements of Olmsted's parks that exemplify his approach, and any insights or recommendations that might enhance somebody's appeal for the parks.
What was the first question again?
Yeah, I'm sorry. Okay. So you talked about engaging community in art. And what did you learn about community engagement generally?
Definitely. That, it can be challenging. I think that it's really important to create relationships first. So that doesn't appear to be a transactional situation, that it's really about and grounded in something that's going to lead to something bigger and more permanent. I think being thoughtful about it is really important. Again, we worked with Grayscale Collaborative, and they did an extensive kind of mapping of who's along the necklace, how their relationships are with the park, their distance, their purpose, et cetera. And so we're really able to be thoughtful about who we selected to be a part of the Committee of Neighborhoods. So being thoughtful, not having a transactional situation, I think I would suggest those two things. And then the second question?
The second question was about if there was anything specific besides that you could help with, any insights or recommendations for enhancing somebody's appeal to get a grant or to have a piece of artwork in the parks themselves.
So this is a tricky one, right? Because it really all depends on what the piece is, what does it do, how does it interact with the landscape? There are certain kind of historical preservation that you need to go through. There are certain stops. I think that talking to the city would be the first thing, maybe reaching out to the Parks Department or even the Conservancy, and talking through what the suggested kind of locations are, what they're interested in, and then we can see what is possible. But ultimately, the permitting is really up to the City of Boston.
Thank you. I hope that helps, Winifred. And there are other questions coming in, and I'm so sorry to say that we are running out of time. And I just want to thank this amazing audience for coming and engaging, and also these incredible panelists who I have been so honored to get to know through this process. And of course, to Dee Dee and the Conservancy who made this all possible. And I think I'll turn it back to you right now, Dee Dee. Thank you, everyone.
Well, thank you so much, Ruth, and thank you all for a very provocative discussion. We have recorded our conversation today, so it is possible for you to see it on YouTube, where we will put it shortly, and I encourage you to revisit the discussion and the ideas that have been set forth. I'm also pleased to have our own announcement when it comes to Olmsted and art. We will be featuring the work of Daniela, a high school sophomore at the Newburgh Free Academy West, on our tote bag at our upcoming conference. And she is the winner of our Downing Park Art Contest, and has also, I might say, been engaged on the ground in renewal efforts in the park. So we want to say congratulations to her in the context of today's conversation. I hope you will also join us for an exciting pop-up trip to Buffalo in late October. Registration is now open for this visit to the Richardson Olmsted Complex, Buffalo Olmsted Parks, and Niagara Falls. You can learn more about this trip, which also offers continuing education credits, in the chat box. So I just want to say thank you again to our wonderful panelists and moderator for engaging a many-layered subject that has taken us from art to utility and to really looking at the engagement of these spaces. So thanks to one and all for coming. Enjoy the last days of summer, and we'll see you again soon. Thanks again.